Sydney was a battle-hardened cruiser that was sunk on the eve of Pearl Harbor.
645 men went into the ocean on a ship called the Sydney and never came back. It was one of the biggest mysteries of the Second World War because the ship was built to win every fight. When experts finally tracked down the wreck at the bottom of the deep sea, they were not ready for the nightmare they found. The metal was torn apart in ways that do not even seem real. HMAS Sydney was a ship in serious difficulties. She had also been hit by something like 87 5.9 in armor-piercing and high-explosive shells. Most people look right past this part of history, but the damage found on the hull tells a story of a struggle that was beyond horrifying. Unbelievable fight that changed everything. The HMAS Sydney was not just any boat, it was a floating fortress that measured 562 feet long. It was built in Great Britain and was known for being incredibly fast, hitting speeds of over 32 knots. To start things off, we have to look at why this ship was so special to the people of Australia. It had 8 massive guns that could fire 6-inch shells, and it had already won a huge battle in the Mediterranean Sea. The crew felt like they were on top of the world as they sailed back toward home in November of 1941. They were escorting a troop ship, and everything seemed totally fine. But here is where it gets tricky. While the Sydney was feeling safe, a German ship called the Cormoran was hiding in the same waters. The Cormoran was not a real warship. It was a cargo boat that the Germans had turned into a secret weapon.
It was 538 feet long and looked like a regular, boring merchant ship. This was a trick used to get close to other boats. Most folks have no idea that the Cormoran was carrying 6 big guns hidden behind fake walls, along with torpedoes and over 300 mines. It was like a wolf in sheep's clothing, waiting for someone to get too close. On the afternoon of November 19th, the two ships saw each other on the horizon about 100 miles away from land. The captain of the Sydney, a man named Joseph Burnett, saw the other ship and thought it looked suspicious. Instead of staying far away and using his big guns, he decided to move closer to see what was going on. This is the part that trips everyone up. Why would such an experienced leader bring his ship so close to a stranger? The Sydney moved to within only 1,000 yards of the Cormoran. At that distance, even small guns could do a lot of damage. The Germans were pretending to be a Dutch ship called the Straat Malacca. They even had fake papers and flags. For over an hour, the two ships talked back and forth using lights and flags. The Sydney kept asking for a secret code to prove the other ship was actually Dutch. The German captain, Theodor Dietz, knew he was caught. He waited until the very last second. Then he ordered his men to drop the fake walls. The German flag went up and they started shooting everything they had at the Sydney. Because they were so close, almost every shot hit its target. The first few shells smashed right into the bridge of the Sydney, which is where all the leaders were standing. It was a total mess in just a few seconds. Wait, there's one big problem. The Sydney was much stronger, but because it was caught by surprise,
It could not fight back very well at first. A torpedo from the German ship hit the Sydney right under its front guns. This caused a huge explosion and started a massive leak. Water began rushing into the ship and it started to tilt to one side. Even though the Sydney was dying, the crew did not give up. They managed to fire back and hit the Cormoran in the engine room. This started a fire on the German ship that they could not put out. For about half an hour, both ships were just blasting each other at close range. It was a scene of fire and smoke that was hard to even imagine. Eventually, the Sydney turned away and started to drift south. It was covered in flames and smoke, and it looked like a giant torch on the water. The Cormoran was also sinking, but its crew was able to get into lifeboats. The men on the Cormoran watched as the Sydney disappeared into the darkness of the night. Not a single person from the Sydney was ever seen alive again. 645 men were just gone. But what they found at the bottom of the ocean changed the whole story forever. Endless search for a sunken legend. After the ship sank, the world was left with a giant hole in its history. For over 60 years, the only people who knew what happened were the Germans who survived. They told stories about the battle, but many people did not believe them. Some folks thought the Germans were lying to cover up something bad. People wondered if a Japanese submarine had helped the Germans, or if the Germans had done something against the rules of war. Because there were no survivors from the Sydney, there was nobody to tell the other side of the story. Let's switch gears for a second and look at how hard it was to find the wreck.
The ocean where they sank is incredibly deep, and the weather is often very rough. Over the years, many groups tried to find the ships, but they always came back with nothing. It was like the Sydney had been erased from the map. The Australian government and the Navy spent a long time looking at old maps and trying to guess where the wind and the waves might have pushed the ships after they were damaged. In the year 2008, a famous shipwreck hunter named David Mirren decided he was going to solve the mystery once and for all. He raised money and used the best technology available, including deep-sea sonar that could see things on the bottom of the ocean floor. Most people look right past how much work this takes. They had to sail out into the middle of nowhere and drag a sensor behind their boat for days and days. It was boring and frustrating work, and many people thought they would fail just like everyone else had. But then something amazing happened. On March 12th, they found a bunch of metal on the seafloor that looked like a ship. It was the Cormoran. Finding the German ship gave them a huge clue because it meant the Sydney had to be close by. They used the coordinates from the German records and started searching in a circle around the first wreck. 5 days later, the sonar picked up something huge. It was the HMAS Sydney, resting over 2 miles beneath the surface. When the news hit the world, it was a huge moment for Australia. Families who had lost their grandfathers and fathers finally had a place to point to on a map. But the real work was just starting. They needed to send down robots with cameras to see what the ship looked like.
They wanted to know if the German stories were true, or if there was a hidden secret that had been kept for all those years. As the robots sank down into the cold, dark water, everyone held their breath. However, the real nightmare was just starting to show up on the camera screens. Terrifying damage nobody expected to find. When the cameras finally reached the Sydney, the images that came back were absolutely shocking. The ship was not just sitting there in one piece, it was torn apart in a way that showed just how much pain the crew must have gone through. To put it in simple words, the ship looked like it had been through a war with a monster. The front part of the ship, called the bow, was completely gone. It had broken off and was laying a short distance away from the rest of the hull. This explained why the ship sank so fast. Without a front, it would have filled with water in an instant. If you look a little closer, you find the real story in the shell holes. There were over 80 holes in the side of the ship from the German cannons. Some of these holes were massive, showing that the German shells had exploded inside the ship, destroying everything in their path. The armor that was supposed to protect the men had been ripped open like it was made of paper. The most horrifying part was the bridge. It was almost completely destroyed. This confirmed that the leaders of the ship were probably gone in the first few minutes of the fight. The cameras also looked at the lifeboats. This is the part that makes absolutely no sense to some people. On most ships that sink, you see lifeboats that were launched or at least tried to be used. But on the Sydney, the lifeboats were still stuck in their racks or were totally destroyed by fire. It seems like the fire on the deck was so hot and so fast that the men could not even get to the boats. The ship's airplane, which sat in the middle of the deck, was also a twisted mess of metal. It had been hit early on and probably caused a huge fire that trapped everyone. Most folks have no idea that the metal was also bent in a way that showed the ship had hit the bottom of the ocean very hard. Because the water is so deep, the pressure is very high. As the ship sank, the air inside parts of the boat would have caused them to pop or crush. The wreck was a graveyard of twisted steel and broken equipment. Seeing the ship like this made the battle feel very real and very scary. It was not just a story in a book anymore. It was a real place where hundreds of men lost their lives in a very short amount of time. The researchers spent days taking thousands of photos and videos. They wanted to make sure they did not miss a single detail. They found that the German ship had used its smaller guns to spray the deck of the Sydney, which would have made it impossible for anyone to stay above deck to fight the fires. It was a very smart but very mean way to fight. The damage was so bad that it was a miracle the ship even stayed afloat for an hour after the battle started. Even after finding the ship, some parts of the puzzle simply refused to fit together. Strange truths the ocean could not hide. Now that the ship was found, the experts had to figure out what it all meant. A big investigation was started to look at all the photos and the data from the wreck.
One of the biggest questions was whether the Germans had done anything wrong. Some people thought the Germans might have shot at the men in the water, but when they looked at the wreck, they did not find any evidence of that. It looked like the ocean and the fires were what did most of the damage. The investigation also looked at the choices made by Captain Burnett. It is hard to say it, but he made some very big mistakes. He followed the rules for a regular day, but he did not follow the rules for a war zone. He should have used his plane to look at the ship from far away. He should have kept his distance so his big guns could win the fight easily. Plain and simple, he was too trusting. He thought he was looking at a harmless cargo ship, and that mistake cost everyone their lives. To say it was a tragedy is not even the half of it. There was also a strange story about a lifeboat that washed up on Christmas Island many months after the battle. Inside the boat was the body of a man in a Navy uniform. For a long time, nobody knew who he was. People wondered if he was from the Sydney. In the year 2021, scientists used modern DNA testing to prove that he was indeed a sailor from the Sydney. His name was Thomas Clark. He was the only person from the ship ever found. It is a very sad detail that makes you wonder if other men tried to swim away but just didn't make it. When you look at the real facts, the battle was won because of surprise and luck. The Germans got lucky with their first few shots, and the Sydney was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This event changed how the Australian Navy did things forever. They realized that they could never be too careful, even when things looked safe. Today, the wrecks are protected as war graves.
Nobody is allowed to touch them or take anything from them. They sit in the dark and quiet miles under the waves as a reminder of that terrible day. Could there be more secrets hidden in the debris field that we have not found yet? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. If you enjoyed this mystery, please like and subscribe for more amazing discoveries. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Share this video with friends and join the discussion on what these findings could mean. Your thoughts and questions are important, so let's explore incredible mysteries together.